Tompkins to faculty over the day. And from what's going on, from what Claire was saying in the general conversation with all these diplomas everywhere, that moving forward, once you get your diploma, and what's so lovely for both myself and Francis is that in 2013, you presented both of us with our diplomas, and life's never been the same.
Not my fault.
So it's great to have you back again, and it was meaningful, and to have you present it then, it was smashing. So without further ado, we'll listen to Stu's talk.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'll give you the £5 later. So, yes, the blurb I wrote was, well, the astrology of the natural world, was discussing various natural phenomenon from an astrological point of view and suggesting significators for polar bears, elephants, or dung beetles, for example. Sue will illustrate many of the often hidden ways in which living things are interconnected. Now, you may be wondering why I am speaking about the natural world, of course, of which we are all a part. And you may be wondering, what can I possibly know about it? And I assure you, I too have been asking these questions. One of the, I'm going to spend you a few minutes explaining why I'm talking about this, really. One of the worst things about giving a lecture, apart from the anxiety of actually doing it, is being asked to select a subject and write some blurb about whatever you're going to say. I find this very difficult because I take the view, how can I know what I'm going to be interested in 6 months' time or 9 months' time or a year's time? And indeed, it's not until you're actually working on something that you know what's really going on and what you want to say. But I guess one reason why, I think it was Lindsay that asked me why I said, oh, I'll talk about the natural world, is because I've always been very interested in nature and wildlife. As a kid, I was very into birds, for example. I can still recognize virtually any bird or wildflower in the UK, a bit geeky, nerdy in that way. And I think someone had just interviewed me about my hobbies and interests outside of astrology, and I probably said as much. And so when asked what I was going to talk about, somehow or other, that's what I went for. And as Lindsay was saying, well, the last time I was guest speaker at Open Day, I probably talked about the kind of things you might expect a speaker to talk about. You know, being an astrologer, the do's and don'ts of being in practice. Something like that, I've no idea. I'll ask Lindsay, I'll ask you after what I spoke about. But this time I wanted to do something very different. I couldn't do the same sort of subject. So another reason why I kind of went for this kind of subject is that, of course, us humans are destroying the planet. Some of you will agree with that. I think it's true. It's been true for a time, but we're really noticing it now. And right now, us Brits are thinking that Brexit is huge. Incidentally, I will be using the B word, so don't think you've escaped from it for the afternoon. So we think that Brexit seems huge. I guess it is. But global warming and what is happening in the natural world and the loss of so much wildlife, this is much bigger. And I think us astrologers should consider and discuss some of these larger questions. You know, it isn't all, well, as Theresa May would say, it's not all about gazing at one's own navel. Anyway, so my goals today, well, one is to entertain. I make no guarantees on that point. I want to be thought-provoking. I can probably pretty much guarantee that that will happen. And I do want to celebrate the fact that all natural things are made from the same stuff. And I will be echoing quite a bit what Lisa was saying this morning. We're made from the same stuff, the stars, the trees, you and I, all animals and plants, everything is made from the same elements. Of course, scientists will bang on about hydrogen and phosphorus and carbon and magnesium and so on. But we're all made of the same stuff, but in different proportions. So I want to celebrate that, and I'd like to kind of illustrate the fact that we are indeed all interconnected. I'm not sure that I quite get there. But the other thing is that, you know, as astrologers, we're very used to thinking of the stars, the planets, whatever they're saying, it's reflected in our life and all the rest of it. But plants and animals are reflected in our horoscope too. If you're obsessed with badgers or kangaroos or dung beetles or beech trees or the White Cliffs of Dover or whatever it is, this too will be shown in your chart. Astrology is very literal, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that fact. Also places. So the other part of this talk is a bit of a call to arms. And the call to arms is really to encourage you to always be really looking at significators. Everything we say or do, every place we go to, everything that's on the news, switch on Radio 4, there's a story about something. Well, why is that story now? Why is it today? Why is it about this place now? Why are you hearing somebody talking about elephants now? You don't ever have to see a client, really. You could be completely disabled as long as you can either watch telly or listen to the radio or something. You can do astrology. So literally everything does have an astrological significator. Each issue can be, each place can be attributed to a sign, a number of signs, to a planet or several, maybe an aspect, and maybe degree areas. Sometimes the odd asteroid and fixed star, but you really don't need to use anything like that, really. So, but nearly all the significators we know and use have been known for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But the world has changed since then in innumerable ways. And I don't feel that our astrology has always kept up. And when I talk about the world changing, I don't just mean the digital age and the things we've noticed in our own life. But, you know, just imagine astrologers hundreds of years ago wouldn't have talked about polar bears. They would never have seen a polar bear. Well, 99.9% of them never would. So there's a lot of room here for discovery. And going back to interconnectedness, we're all aware of the Hermetic doctrine and the 7 principles, and in particular, the one that Lisa was talking about this morning, the principle of correspondence, the idea of as above, so below, as within, so without. We're all very familiar with this idea. But I feel we could go further with it. You know, the usual idea is whatever happens on any level of reality, physical, emotional, or mental, also happens on every other level. As it is in the heavens, so it is on earth, we say. As it is on the physical plane, so it is on the mental and spiritual planes. As it is in the body, so it is in the psyche. And of course, the mind-body relationship, all these relationships aren't causal, just that one is a reflection of the other. I mean, often astrologers use the macrocosm, microcosm way of discussing this thing. And then the notion that the planets are the macrocosm and the oneself is a microcosm. The idea being, the sort of thing we bang on about, we say that if we understand the one, say what is happening in the sky, we're offered an opportunity for better understanding the other, ourselves, and the world we live in. We use this idea in some of the techniques we use, in progressions, for example. With secondary progressions, well, with all progressions, we say one unit of time encapsulates another unit of time. Secondary progressions, a day equals a year. But the macrocosm-microcosm idea can apply to almost anything in our universe. Your oak trees, your elephants, your whales. And understanding one of those can shed light, can provide an opportunity for some understanding of the other. Well, many people have commented on this over the years. I mean, Gurdjieff would say, it's impossible to study a system of the universe without studying humans. At the same time, it's impossible to study a human without studying the universe. Each of us is an image of the world. Each of us was created by the same laws which created the cosmos as a whole. By knowing and understanding oneself, one can know and understand the whole world, all the laws that create and govern the universe, he goes on. He goes on, the study of the world and the study of the individual must run parallel, one assisting and furthering the other. And I mean, we're all astrologers here, and what marks out an astrologer from a non-astrologer? And I think it's the way that knowledge is viewed. Ordinary knowledge is composed of single particular ideas which are viewed separately. Esoteric knowledge is a knowledge of the whole. Things are not separate. So your polar bears, your oak trees, your dung beetles, whatever, are not separate to us. We're all part of the same whole. Spiritual is a word often used by astrologers. And the spirit, people can define that in different ways. But the spirit is usually thought of as being the animating or vital principle in humans and animals and in all of the natural world. So for me, a human spiritual journey cannot be separated from the rest of that natural world. And we would all agree with that, I'm sure. But that can also mean looking at the natural world to find out about ourselves. Now, the other reason, I suppose, that I'm talking about this is that I always like any excuse to show the mappa mundi, the map of the world. And I'm afraid I am doing the same thing as Lisa. And there are various versions of this. So I've done it from the point of view of the East is over there. I don't know, there's no way I can do a little thingy, is there? You've got it. Yeah, baby, he's got it. Toby has a history of rescuing me. Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah. So we think of the ascendant as there, don't we, the birth moment. So, but you can draw this in differing ways. So, sunrise, sunset, your middle of your day, midnight down here. And, the sun rises in the east and so on. So that's very familiar. And you can just think, well, if it doesn't rain, the wettest time of day is first thing in the morning. And the driest time of day is, in the evening. It's hot up here, midday, and it's cold down here. So we can add that. We're also at our, the individual when they're born is at their wettest. Those of you who are like me, a little bit over 40, will know that you get drier as you get older. Yeah, so that's going a little bit further. And you could put water, the elements there, water, fire, earth, and air. That's a little bit controversial. Not all astrologers do it that way. Yes, I'll carry on. And you can go a little bit further if you want. I mean, summer, this is also time of day, so this is dawn. So the hottest is at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. It's not hottest at midday, it's hotter here. And the summer is the hottest season. And spring, well, wet and warm. And this idea of putting taste here, sweet with hot. Actually, the longer you have the fruit on the tree in the sun, the sweeter it gets. When you fry your onions, they get sweet. And air, you see, is often put up here. That's the traditional astrological thing, is air's put up here. But I actually think air belongs down here. You know, if you want to make things colder, you blow on it. And you can have, and if you leave things out in the air, they go sour. And things that are bitter often grow dry things, and so on. You can carry on with this indefinitely. So you can also, well, so you've got basically you've got a map of a human life, a human day, a human year, and they all mirror each other. So we're kind of familiar with this. As I say, there's slightly different versions of this. This is the one that I personally favour. And you can have colours too. If this is blue and that's red, well, that's purple. You know, if that's red and that's yellow, that's orange, and so on. Some people would draw a little yin-yang symbol here. In a sense, this marks both death and conception. You can almost think of the planet breathing in and out, just like the individual does. And if you want to, you can add the lunations and all the rest of it. So I like doing that. And you could actually, if you want to, you could put kind of animals here, because if you're thinking about polar bears, where they live in the cold and the wet, maybe we put polar bears in this quadrant. Maybe we put elephants up here. Maybe you could. I haven't really thought about that too much, but you know, you can put almost anything there really. Anyway, I just like any excuse to remind us of how these things mirror each other. And practitioners of alternative medicine, various complexions, use these in various different ways. I think the first time I became aware of an animal in the horoscope was, before I get on, just want to say a little bit about significators. We have significators in a general way, and we have them in a more specific way. And when I'm talking about animals here today, I'm stuck very much on the general. Let's look at an example of what I mean. So the arms, if I said, what's the significator for arms? You might say Gemini. And then if you went a little bit further, well, you'd say, well, the shoulder is Taurus, the upper arm is Gemini, and actually the elbow is Cancer. I bet you didn't know that, really. But if your knees are Capricorn, your elbows have to be Cancer. And the forearm is Leo, and the hands, I would say, are Virgo. You might want to stick with Gemini there. But then you can go to a medieval drawing, which will go that bit further and say, well, the top of the finger is air, you know, each of the phalange has a different sign. And I think we all know basic palmistry for planets and so on. So you can see there are different layers of signification, really. Or the head, we'd always say the head was Aries. Well, some of the head, some of it's Taurus. But, you know, to a medieval astrologer, they might have added some of this. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just, although quite often when you play with some of these traditions, you find that they do have something quite interesting going on. So when I'm talking about significators, I'm talking about it in quite a simple sort of way. Yes. Oh, yes. And yeah. So here's I'm not leaving this up, but this is a little rough idea of, as far as I've got, and it's partly tradition of the animal kingdom. You know, if I said large cats, you'd go for Leo, wouldn't you? If I said fish, you'd probably go for Pisces. I'll go for Aquarius and birds. Okay. And then you could do subdivisions. Don't take this too seriously. It's a work in progress. There was a story actually earlier in the year, which I didn't get time to look at the astrology, but there was a story of how some pigeons had got into a supermarket and pest controllers were brought in and the pigeons were shot. There was, I don't know whether you remember that story, it was a bit of an outcry. I shared in the outcry, really. But, you know, that day, what is it there about that day, which is of pigeons? If you don't believe Aquarius and birds, you can, the RSPB always does its bird count. I can just assure you in a number of different ways that's true. So anyway, the first time, yeah, I think I was really aware of an animal was when I was teaching a new beginners class in a local authority class. And the very first class, you know, the teacher always gets there first, make sure the chairs are right and everything's working and all the rest of it. And some students arrive early too. And this particular woman came in the class and I learned very quickly, ascendant, first house stuff, the first thing you notice about somebody actually. It's always worth really clocking that. Anyway, she was talking about tortoises. And it transpired that she kept tortoises and in fact bred them. She was an expert on tortoises. It is now illegal in the UK to import or sell wild caught tortoises. So all tortoises here have to be bred from tortoises that are already here. And she was at the vanguard of actually breeding tortoises. And for me, that is the significator of the tortoise, the Saturn in Cancer in the first house. So a tortoise, what do we know about tortoises? Well, I don't know a huge amount, but a tortoise is a terrestrial turtle. So it's very like a turtle, the same family, but it doesn't swim. So all tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. So tortoises, we know, are known for a few distinctive features. They're naturally long lifespans. Tortoises in the Galapagos live 100, 150 years. They're very slow movements, and they're large half-dome shells. And the shell is a signature asset for the tortoise, allowing the animal to retract its head and make its limbs inside to ward off predators. That's what we all probably recognize about tortoises. I'm sure there's a lot more to them. Apparently, they recognize, if your domestic pet tortoise will recognize their owners, how they look and their voice, and they apparently appear to like some humans better than others. Anyway, so I would say Saturn in the first house in Cancer, I suppose if one's thinking slightly psychologically, one would think that she identifies with the tortoise. You could interpret that in a number of ways. You could say she goes out into the world as a responsible mother, Saturn in Cancer, or a dutiful mother. She does things on time. Or you could say Saturn's always about our lessons, so that there's a lesson here concerning safety and protection. Is it fanciful to think that tortoises teach her that in some way? Of course, she's involved with the safety and protection of them. You know, someone aware of the dangers of being unprotected. And another way of thinking about Saturn in Cancer, you might think Saturn in Cancer, an image would be the castle, the fortified home. And the tortoise's shell actually isn't its home, but it feels like it. It's actually part of the anatomy of the tortoise. So you could say that the tortoise actually in some sense lives in a castle, because it's not safe out there. And in a way, that is how it was for her. It's not quite safe out there. She was born just after the war. I think the family had lost a home and bombed out, whatever, anyway. But anyway, there's the notion of going out into the world, defending oneself, defending one's family, one's home, defending one's emotionalism, you might say. So, you know, talking about this tortoise relationship, you can think it's purely psychological, which of course it is. And, you know, you could no doubt point to millions of people who have a focal Saturn in Cancer and no interest or experience with tortoises whatsoever, which is true. But I'd say it's not just psychological, you see. I would also say it's literal. Now, okay. Yes, I meant to bring a copy of the Radio Times. If you're interested in significators, TV magazines, and some of these are online, are a good thing to watch. It's a good thing to watch. Sometimes you'll see an actor on 3 different channels in a different program. And if it's an actor you don't really see all the time on telly, you can almost bet your bottom dollar that that person has some kind of transit to their midheaven or something. But this is also quite useful in terms of, well, studying almost anything. And there was one day, oh, there's a tortoise. This is one of the Galapagos tortoises. And yeah, there was a day, now what day was it? The 4th of January. On three separate TV channels, there was a program about the Galapagos, you know, which are often on TV because, you know, they have so much wildlife and all the rest of it. So, you know, no big thing really. But the word Galapagos means islands of tortoises. This was, you can't really put a time on it. I've just done, I didn't watch the programs, but they were not the same program. Okay. Oh, well, that's kind of slightly interesting. And I suppose I was aware I was doing this talk. So thinking, but anyway, so it's quite interesting. Of course, the sun was in Capricorn. You know, we've got all this stuff here in Capricorn, including the moon. So it has a sort of something thingy about it. Now, it happened to be, of course, you could look at that as the transit. So this is the transit for the UK. This is when Saturn was actually conjunct the Sun. You're all aware, I'm sure, that Pluto has been, still is slightly fading, but Pluto's been opposing the moon. If you're a Remainer, you'd say it's the UK committing suicide. If you are a Brexiteer, I'm sure you'd say, well, it's having a clean-up or some such thing. But anyway, so Saturn was on the Sun, and there was a new moon here, just around there. I think the new moon was at the Saturn-Pluto midpoint. And the Sun moon midpoint. Anyway, we don't need to worry about all of that. But anyway, so I think, you see, at this time, this was actually the start of people in the UK getting a bit frightened, Saturn on the Sun. And it was just a few days before the first vote, Theresa May's first vote on her deal. So things were getting a bit precarious. I thought, well, why didn't I actually relocate the UK's chart to the Galapagos Islands? And but that Saturn on the Sun actually is angular in the Galapagos. And then I had a very strange happening. Somebody came to see me who works in the EU in a vaguely government, anyway, whatever. So of course we ended up talking about the B word. And he actually said, he said, well, the UK are behaving like a tortoise. No, I kid you not, he said that. So being a bit slow, I think he meant. I think he also meant maybe feeling easily threatened, being overly defensive. you know, putting our head back in the shell. And I suppose I was thinking about Theresa May's red line. You know, in the Galapagos and its extraordinary wildlife, apparently there's 20 or so islands, 97% of these islands have been declared a national park. And the number of visitors is controlled. And in a way, it kind of mirrors Theresa May's red lines, worrying about boundaries, trying to control the number of immigrants. That's one of her red lines. Anyway, maybe, whatever. It's all about borders, 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 and boundaries. Anyway, well, that was my tortoise experience. But I have a real sense that Cancer, Capricorn, or Moon, Saturn, that, you know, that would be, I think you would all probably think, oh yeah, if I'm going to put a little bit of symbolism around tortoises, that's where I'll go. Yes. I mean, this was, with the UK, this was the absolute, really, really talking about borders and the Irish backstop. It was all about borders. Anyway, whatever. Ah, well, there you go. A polar bear. I like that one, really. Actually, I really learned something astrological and even Brexiting from looking at polar bears. So what do we know about polar bears? Well, they're marine animals that live in and around the Arctic Ocean. They need and depend on sea ice. You know, their main food is seals, but apparently they eat other things, eggs, vegetation, birds, whatever. They could smell their prey up to 1 kilometer away, and beneath a meter of compacted snow, you know, they can smell a seal, their main dinner, right 1 meter down there, and they just wait for the seal to come up. And apparently, so apparently half of polar bear's life is spent hunting for food, but only about 2% of their hunts are successful. So, you know, when you watch programs about polar bears, we're reminded all the time about the rapid and dramatic decline in sea ice with global warming. You know, there's a longer melting season, so ice is forming later and breaking up earlier, and this particularly affects the females, because they have to store up a lot of fat in order to nurse their cubs and give birth to them and so on. So they can swim for ages, but I watched a TV program where, well, I don't know how the commentator knew, but he was saying that this polar bear is going to drown because the sea ice is going. But polar bears are going further distances in search of their food. And brown bears, grizzlies, are going further north, I think. Anyway, apparently there's interbreeding. Now, there have been lots of examples, or certainly some examples, I understand, of grizzly bears and polar bears mating when they're kept in captivity. But now there's clear evidence that it's happening in the wild, as their habitats merge. So these are crossbreed bears, and they're called pisleys or roller bears. But they are hybrids. Apparently scientists reckon there are another 20 plus mammals in the Arctic that are likely to do this interbreeding. You could say it's a sign of the resilience of the natural world. But it was the word hybrid when I was thinking about it, because I think it's a big word for Neptune in Pisces, hybrid. It's quite an old word, since it's the 1700s. I mean, more and more dogs are hybrid. I mean, we've always had mongrels. But now we have designer dogs, you know, labradoodles, cockapoos. The Labradoodle was originally bred in Australia around 1989 in an attempt to provide a guide dog for a blind woman whose husband had allergies. So they got these two dogs together. And actually in 1989, Saturn, Neptune and Uranus were all in Capricorn. And when you see Neptune with Saturn, indeed Uranus with Saturn, you think, well, this is a breaking of boundaries, Uranus, or a dissolving of boundaries, Neptune's. So some of these hybrid dogs, if you're dog people, you will know, but you know, these hybrid dogs are kind of breeds in their own right now. Huge percentages of people are having hybrid dogs. Cars, hybrid technology we've had in cars, that dates from the late 90s, really. You know, the first Toyota Prius was launched in Japan in 1997 when Neptune was in Capricorn. But there's at least 6 hybrid cars for sale in the UK now, and about a quarter of people who buy new cars buy a hybrid. So I was thinking, well, this is Neptune in Pisces. Pisces, the sign that doesn't recognize boundaries or borders, doesn't recognize distinctions. This is what Pisces is about. The Pisces stage of the zodiac teaches us that we are all one. There can't be boundaries. And for me, Pisces has always been the sign of mixed race relationships. You know, the idea of what I was doing earlier, showing you animals and then, you know, like birds, and then you go each different type of bird. Well, you can do that with anything. You could do religions, and you can think, well, what's an Aries religion? What's a Taurus religion? And you can do it with marriages. You can do it with anything. And if you did it for something like relationships, you'll find that Pisces is very much the sign of mixed race relationships. And you could say that the polar bear grizzly relationship is a mixed race relationship. They're both bears. In fact, I think one evolved from the other. And if one wants to bring Brexit into it, one could see maybe the lesson for Parliament is really that there has to be an interbreeding of ideas and policies. Maybe, you know, you've got different types of bears in the house. They're all bears, but they're different types of bear. And maybe what is needed, what we'll have to have is a hybrid, really. So I actually came to all that understanding through looking at polar bears. It may not be desperately profound, but I think we can look at the natural world and learn from it. Now, what have I got next? Oh, yes, well, I'm going to talk about dung beetles, okay? You know, it's quite interesting to think about insects. I got a bit upset when I was thinking about insects and the signs of the zodiac because there's so many insects. Apparently over 1 million species of insects are known. And you can look at the ratio of insects to humans. If you look at that online, you'll see some estimate about 200 million insects to 1 human. And others would put 1.4 billion insects to 1 human. So I think somebody out there hasn't had a life because they've been going around. But on the macrocosm, microcosm agenda, insects really are a macrocosm. And insects, sole source of food for many birds, and reptiles and amphibians and so on, the pollinators and, well, the decomposers. And that's what dung beetles are now. So, dung beetles. Now, the interesting thing, of course, what I should come to is really looking, if one wanted to look at significators for major animals, the other thing to do is to look at the experts on this. And so I said, plonked dung beetles in this. As soon as I'd sent it off, Why? Oh, I don't even know what a dung beetle looks like. But, you know, that was months ago, months ago. It's very interesting, really, because Richard Attenborough last night was talking about dung beetles. And last Sunday, there was one of the experts, Dr. Sarah Bainan, this is on BBC television, was taking a cowpat apart and showing dung beetles. She has an insect farm with her restaurant, her chef husband. And well, I think they cook insects, but anyway, but her farm is devoted to insects. I wrote to her and asked for her birth details, but I've had no response. But that's the other thing you need to do, I guess, is to look at the charts for experts on your particular field, which I've done for elephants, as we'll come to. So there's, you know, millions plus species of insect, who knows, but 350,000 species of beetle and 30,000 species of scarabs. And not all scarabs are dung beetles. So the scarabs, you know, may not use dung. They may eat plants or fruit or fungi. But true dung beetles, apparently there's about 6,000 species. And last night, David Attenborough, was showing us a dung beetle that gets about by following the Milky Way. The Milky Way. And that's a nocturnal dung beetle. So dung beetles, they sometimes eat dung. There's lots of different types of beetles. Some roll in it, some eat it, some do all sorts of things with it. But the important thing about them is that they clean things up. Without dung beetles, the planet would be in a terrible state. And the Egyptians used to, well, the scarabs in ancient Egypt, they were promoted to being a god. Anyway, whatever, but this kind of put me in touch with the notion of Jung. Now, there's 2 dung beetles for you out of the 6,000. That's a granite one from Egypt. And this is a little story from Jung. Now, so Jung tells the story when he's writing about synchronicity. The word synchronicity, there are different definitions of it, but I quite like the definition of falling together in time. Whether you can see, Jung has a Saturn square Pluto. I'll come back to it in a minute, but I think in his chart, it's the significator of these types of beetles, of scarabs anyway. And so it's in his book on synchronicity, or volume 8 of his collected works. It's actually a big story for him. This is not a little flyaway little thing. This is one of his big stories. And he says, my example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite, oh my God, I've just seen the time, who in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. Of course, if I was his supervisor, I might think psychologically inaccessible to you or psychologically inaccessible. But anyway, we won't go there. He said the difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education and rationalism, and he carries on and carries on. I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had an impressive dream. She had had an impressive dream the night before in which someone had given her a golden scarab. an expensive, costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned around and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to be very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabide beetle. This is the beetle it was, or the common rose chaffer. Basically, the nearest to a golden scarab that you would find in Europe. And so he catches the beetle and he hands it to her. She's still in the middle of the story about her dream, and he hands her this beetle. So you can imagine that this is a tremendous coincidence or matter of synchronicity. So he tells that story. And of course, what one would really like to know is the date that this happened, but I don't know this date. Anyway, the rose chaffer can be spotted on garden flowers. He likes roses, particularly dog roses. And you see, this was another little synchronous thing for me, because I happen to be, I know you're going to think I watch television all the time, but truly I don't. But I happen to be watching Michael Portillo in Bulgaria the other evening. And in Bulgaria, they get most of their, that's where 70% of rose oil comes from. So he was picking the roses and involved in making the rose oil. But as there was all these roses there, and I could see millions of these. They weren't mentioned, but I could see millions of them. You see, I suppose what I would say, there's something of the scarab in the sky as we speak. Why am I talking about this today? So the rose chaffer doesn't eat dung, but it is an important recycler of nutrients because it feeds on decaying matter. So it's a detritivore. So, you know, it feeds on decaying matter and recycles nutrients. So, so there you are. I think that this is Jung's Saturn square Pluto. How would you read that? Well, obsessed by time? I think he was obsessed by time. You could think that Pluto is the planet of, well, I don't know. It's something about taking responsibility for the unconscious, including mental illness, taking responsibility for what's buried, what's taboo. Taking responsibility for cleaning things up. And on some level, I guess as an analyst, he was doing that. Whatever. But of course, it's quite interesting, really. So Saturn square Pluto, you can buy it or not. But I think that the beetle is in his chart. And that he, you know, it would have been very interesting to have had a conversation with him at the time, because one could use the beetle. He's looking at it from the coincidence point of view. But I would say that you could use the beetle for, you know, study the actual beetle to learn about him and the situation and possibly the client. Of course, right now, well, this is the full moon, but we have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Saturn-Pluto again. And you'll notice that the Mars-Venus square, this is the full moon, it's not for now, but it's as near as damn it. But you'll notice that the full moon square, Venus-Mars square, is at 23, and that Mars at 23 of Taurus actually falls on Jung's Saturn-Pluto rose chaffer square, I would think about it. Anyway, whatever. I think I might move swiftly on. Okay, so, oh, elephants. I don't know whether I want to do elephants, really. I think I might skip elephants. Or maybe I won't. All right. So, elephants. What do we know about elephants? You know, with these talks, you're not allowed to speak, but it would be quite good if you could. So, what do we know about them? We know that they, well, even the most cynical researcher would say that elephants have intense social groups where they get extremely upset when one of their own dies. You know, so they have funeral rites. You know, they seem to express feelings like joy, love, jealousy, empathy, grief, and anger. I've got a whole shed load of stuff here about elephants, but maybe I will skip some of it. So there's African elephants and there's Asian elephants. African elephants, about 90% of them apparently have been wiped out in the last century. So that's been going on for quite a while, but we're really very aware of it now. And we were told that more elephants are being killed each day than are being born. That's around 20,000 African elephants a year. And that's partly because of the growing demand for ivory in China and the Far East, which puts the cost of ivory up. And so hunting becomes, you know, more the norm. And Asian elephants, the problem is more about habitat loss, human-elephant conflict. Elephant and humans want the same space. It kind of mirrors our housing crisis, really. And then I was looking at elephants in Mozambique, and I was literally writing these notes here. Next day, cyclone in Mozambique. It's quite interesting because in Mozambique and there was a civil war for 15 years, and 90% of the elephants went really to pay for finances, weapons on both sides. But since the war, the female elephants don't really produce tusks anymore. And in places in South Africa, one place in South Africa, 98% of female elephants don't produce tusks. And the males, the tusks are getting much smaller. Maybe this is a way of nature being resilient here. Of course, not having tusks has its problems because tusks are used. But anyway, what kind of, you know, using the tusk as part of the ecosystem. I won't go into all that. I'm not an expert on elephants. But, you know, there are experts out there on elephants. And I've only got one with a birth time, and that's Saba Douglas Hamilton, who you may have seen on TV doing animal. You'll see she's got a sun in the same place as the faculty, which is where my Jupiter is and where Neptune is squaring. So this is all chaos. Anyway, you know, when I think about elephants, I think of the sign of Cancer. It's back to Cancer, Capricorn. Tusks are outgrown teeth. That's what they are. And Pluto in Capricorn, for me, is about really being aware of the destruction of elephants. Not that it's not always been going on, but it's a real awareness. And maybe, I would argue, probably, if somebody asked me, but if we're going to save elephants, we have to do it while Pluto's still in Capricorn. So I think there is stuff about Cancer. But it's also interesting that if you do look at experts, you get quite a few. Oh, I'm at the lost paper stage. Yes, I'm at the lost paper stage, but anyway, I can probably remember. Yes, on some of these experts, there's a particular degree area that comes up, and it's between 20 and 23 degrees of Leo. Saba means 7, so that's why she was called Saba, because she was born on the 7th of June, 1970 at 7 p.m, and she was the 7th grandchild. But her father was the first elephant conservationist, Ian Douglas Hamilton, still alive, still involved with elephant conservation as far as I know. And there is a World Elephant Day, which is what I've lost on my piece of paper. But the sun is about 23 of Leo on that day. There is a World Polar Bear Day as well. I don't think I talked about oh yes, Pisces with polar bears. Anyway, I don't know, 4 of Cancer comes up quite a bit. whatever. You know, you wouldn't look at this chart and obviously think elephants, but when you know elephants, she's in charge of one of the major charities and of a particular national park, the Samburu National Park, I think, which may be in Kenya. She's always lived amongst elephants. Anyway, I think I ought to start wrapping this up. But what I really want to, well, yes, I suppose I might wrap this up. What I really want to wrap up is the notion of really astrology can be very, very simple. Now, this is a man I know who's from South America, lived for a time in the UK, but loves Spain. He loves Spain. Actually, he only ever lives in Spain. He has done, him and his wife, since the year dot, even though he doesn't really speak Spanish very well. And for me, well, there's 5 planets in Taurus, some of them in the 9th house. And if you look at the charts for Spain, I don't think Taurus particularly features. But if you think about it, it doesn't have to be fact. It's the image of Spain. Sorry, Gloria, wherever you are. But, you know, you think of bullfights, you think of it being dry and fertile, and things like that. When Uranus went into Taurus last year, within virtually the week, we had the Catalan independence story going on. So I'd say that just very basic way of thinking about where are you going next weekend? If you're going to Bognor or wherever you're going, what is it in your chart? Precisely. Oh, this is me a couple of years ago. So, well, it's actually a couple of years ago, 19th of September 2016. There was a Saturn-Neptune square in the sky, which picked up my own natal Neptune at 26 of Libra. So in a way, you've got Saturn-Neptune twice. Okay, you've got it in the sky, and yet Saturn is semi-square my Neptune, Neptune is sesquiquadrate my Neptune. Anyway, I was due to go somewhere, and a tooth fell out. I had a temporary tooth put in the day before I was due to fly. I was on the plane and the temporary tooth fell out. Well, that sounds like Saturn Neptune, doesn't it? Loss of tooth. Astrology is simple and literal. But where would I be going? Where is there of a Saturn Neptune nature? Well, I think you'd expect a lot of water and you'd expect old buildings, possibly. It could have been all sorts of different places, millions of different places, but it was Venice. Sounds like Saturn Neptune, could you get? Oh yes, well that's another example, but I won't, well I will show you that actually. I probably have shown this a few times. So this was some years ago, a group of friends, most of them in South London. We meet together for birthdays and tend to do things. Anyway, on this particular year, one of the group was going to be 60 and she wanted us all to go to Morocco. She's a Scorpio, so we're going to Morocco in November. I didn't want to go. I was looking at this in March and I thought, you know, November is a very busy time of year. I knew I'd have transiting Saturn opposing my Sun, squaring my natal Saturn. So I thought, I don't want to do this. But anyway, sometimes you just have to do this. So a few days before we're due to fly, one of my clients actually wanted me to go to Burleigh House, B-U-R-G-H, okay, an Elizabethan manor house in Hertfordshire, north of London. So I went to Burleigh House, and then I went to Marrakech. We had a nice holiday. It was very cold, not what you normally expect, but Saturn, it was very cold. Anyway, what Bur means is walled city. That's what it means. And Marrakech is indeed a walled city. Now, it was very Saturnian, you know, you're surrounded by beasts of burden. Saturn went up into the Atlas Mountains. Saturn, it was cold, Saturn. And then I happened to be reading this book, which is set in Edinburgh. Okay. It was in the days when you had some kind of music thing, which I forgot what the MP3, I think it was. Anyway, going home on the plane, I dropped some water on my Saturn and Neptune. I dropped some water on my MP3 and it stopped working. But when I got home, I don't know, somebody fixed it for me or something or other. Anyway, by some kind of accident, I downloaded Christa Berg. I could give you dozens of these sort of examples, but you have them. And you can learn, I did learn about, well, you can learn all sorts of things about yourself as well as a bit of practical information. So although I've done this as jokey, it still can be meaningful. You see, Saturn transits, it's about boundaries, you know, and with a shed load of people staying for a weekend. I would never go anywhere with a shed load of people, actually. Except astrology students. Yes, okay, well, I think I probably have to, I'm going to do an advert, actually, going away with astrology students, do an annual residential course this year in Spain, medical astrology this year, that we have live clients that you will meet. So do go to my website. Let's see, somewhere up here. So I'd like to say any questions, but you're not allowed.